All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today I've got something for you that I think will kind of dovetail in well with one of my earlier videos. I did a video earlier about editing in stages, about having a focus for a particular stage of editing, a particular draft of a book or a work or a story of any kind. And as I've been editing and redrafting my novel over and over again over the last too long, I thought it would be good to kind of talk about a few of the different stages, number one, that I've used, and number two, that I think, have a good place in an editing process, and kind of like an order of operations, kind of a how and why. So, without further ado, let's get into this. Now, I'm going to kind of arrange these in this video per like what part of the editing process that should happen, right? So, I listed five different things, five different methods. And the third one that I came up with, that I wrote down and wrote about, is the one I'm going to talk about first. And what I'm going to call it is kind of like character setting or theme development. Now, this is one of those things where you've written something and, you're satisfied with it, but there's always like a character that kind of didn't get enough, screen time, so to speak, or something like a character's characteristic that you want to kind of explore more carefully. There can be a setting that is, not as detailed as you'd like, and you think, well, maybe there's something to be added here that would be helpful. Or even if you're like trying to like work in some kind of, ongoing theme throughout the work itself, there might be places where either that theme is not served well, or where it could be served better, or where you could add service to it, add a thematic element to it that maybe you didn't think to add it there in your first draft or two. So, in general, we all want to have more interesting characters. We want to have more detailed settings. We want to have more subtle and or consistent themes. So what do? Generally speaking, throughout one of your early redrafting sessions, what you'll probably want to do is look for places where either language is vague, look for places where dialogue is replaced with like a description of dialogue. Look for places where something that a character cares about is mentioned, or dislikes is mentioned. Look for places where the pace slows down naturally, and look for places where thematic elements are present, and look for places where thematic elements are absent. So what you'll do is you'll kind of read through at a regular speed your work in this particular focus session, and you will find places where a character, where you can think of like, oh well, this character could have reacted to this in a certain way, or oh yeah, they went to this place and I didn't really describe it very well, so let's add, and the pace here is kind of slow already, so let's add a little bit more description. It won't affect the pace too much because the pace is already slow, but what it'll do is it'll help to flesh out this particular area. Or you might be reading through it and you might say, well, wait a minute, kind of one of the main ideas I want to talk about in this story or in this book is X. And right here, there's a point here that doesn't really match up well or mesh up well with X. Can I make it mesh up well with X? Or right here, there's nothing going on with the theme that I want to promote. Can I add something here? And so what you'll do for this type of, focus editing session is you'll read through the story at kind of a regular pace, but what you'll pay attention to are for these missing details or even incongruous details. Although for the purposes of this one, you'll probably want to just look for those incongruities first. Hey, I want to talk about, this character, is a big sports fan, and someone's talking to sports around this character, and this character doesn't chime in. Is that part of their character that they wouldn't chime in, or would they maybe hop in, or would they have some thoughts about it that I can detail, for instance? There's a character who's an engineer, and someone is talking about an engineering problem. What is his reaction to talking about an engineering problem? Does he look at it rationally? Does he kind of look at it as a fun puzzle to solve? Does he offer like suggestions when they're not asked for? Does he think about the possibility of offering a suggestion and decide against it in the long run, kind of thing? And so this is kind of like my earliest thing that you can do to help kind of flesh out a story a little bit better. Basically, you look through and you find places where you can add a little bit to a character's interactions with other characters, interactions with the setting, where you can add setting details without damaging the pacing, and where any ideas that you're trying to get across are present where they can be present. So that's number one. Number two, and I don't have a formal name for this. I'm just going to call it kind of like a plot S or a plot curve. And it's not really a curve because a curve goes from one place to another place, but this is something a little bit different. In early editing sessions, you may find that you kind of like write a story and it just kind of happens as you would expect it to. Bob goes to the store, he picks up some ketchup, he pays for the ketchup, he heads home, he gets home, he puts the ketchup on his French fries. That's a very basic story. And it's an exaggeration to say that the story that you've already written is going to be that basic. I'm not trying to say that your story is that simple. However, there can be places where there's a spot in the plot or a spot in the story where you go from A to B in a straight line, so to speak, right? He gets in the car, he drives to the store. Simple. He arrives at the store, right? But what you could do, if you felt like it, is you could add what I'm kind of calling like a plot S or an S curve into the story where you don't change the beginning or ending point, but what you do is you add more material in between to kind of bring out the interesting parts of that trip. And, it doesn't have to be anything complicated. It could be something as simple as, oh, well, his car didn't start. Oh, so he had to get a jump from his neighbor, right? That's like a really simple version of an S curve that you can add to the plot. You could say, again, my example is incredibly simplistic, but to go to something a little bit more complicated, if you have characters doing a certain thing and going to a certain place, you can have it be that there's an obstacle that appears. And you can add quite a bit of material by saying, okay, well, instead of just getting from A to B, smooth and easy, let's put an obstacle in there. And what you can do with that is you can use that opportunity to, number one, showcase which characters are good at problem solving for that particular type of problem. Number two, you can have more character interactions, which gives them a little bit more fleshed outness. You can have more opportunities for dialogue and other development. This is especially useful for villains, right? Because if you have an antagonist, that antagonist presumably is working against your characters. And so if there's something that this villain or this antagonist could anticipate and kind of counter before it appears, then, if you're trying to write a smart villain, a clever villain, then what you want to do is maybe have him do something to make it more difficult for them to achieve their goals, right? And you might not have put this into the story initially, but you might say, oh, well, wait a minute. This part they get from here to here, and it's pretty simple. I could add something in between that makes it more interesting. There was an example of this in the book that I'm currently writing, where they basically went to, it's basically a rescue mission, right? So they're trying to find some people that are being held hostage by some pirates. And this is kind of a science fiction space setting, whatever. That's not really relevant, but whatever. So they basically, they're trying to do reconnaissance. And, what I had initially is that they do some reconnaissance. They find, they go to a couple of different star systems and they just say, well, they're not here, they're not here, they're not here. Then they finally get to one and they're like, okay, well, we get here. We got them here. And, we had this plan to make it so they couldn't detect us. So we tried that out. And we did the plan and they didn't detect us, we think. And so we go out, we get everybody together, we come in and the mission begins, right? But instead what happened was I said, well, wait a minute, this is getting way too easy. Why don't I try to make the antagonists in this situation a little bit smarter? They could have a listening post that's outside of their particular station. In fact, if they have a big station, they might be inclined to do that. And so what we'll do is we'll have them drop in, do the recon, leave, and get everybody together and come back. But when they come back, everybody's gone. That is to say, the pirates have left because they did detect them. They didn't have a sign that they were detected while they were there, and so they continued their plans going forward. And oh, this was a mistake, and so now they have to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure out how to find a trace of these people. They now have an abandoned space station to explore. That also gives them more things to do, more character interactions. And then, what I did was I said, well, they could find something on the station. That'd be the easiest thing to do. But in fact, well, wouldn't it be fun if there was someone who kind of didn't get the message that the station was abandoned, right? And that allows me to introduce a new character, introduce some more character conflicts, introduce a little bit of mystery in an early chapter, which gets resolved rather quickly, but, to the point where the reader might be like, oh, what's going on? And then it's like, oh, okay, cool. And so, this was an S curve to the plot where, they went from A to B, but now instead, or to make it more alphabetical, they went from A to D normally in a straight line, but now they went from A to B to C to D, right? And those opportunities at B and C give my characters more opportunities to show off their specialties, to interact with each other, to agree or disagree with each other. It gives my villains a little bit more depth and intelligence, stuff like that. So this is another thing that you probably want to do early on in your editing process, right? Because what you're going to do early in the editing process is you're going to add stuff. You're going to say, oh, I could add something here. Oh, I could add something here. I could make this more detailed. I could give this character another line. I could make this setting a little bit more, fleshed out. I could serve my theme better here, here, and here by adding a little sentence here and a little sentence here and a little sentence here. You're adding little bits here and there, and sometimes you're adding even a pretty significant amount. For instance, there are 4 chapters that have been added to the book since my first draft, and not only are those 4 chapters added, but after I finished the first drafts of those 4 chapters, I put another S curve throughout those chapters in order to make them a little bit more interesting and complex. So this is one of those things that can pretty much be used anywhere, right? Like, there are places where you don't want to use it, where like the interim is very, very short. If someone's walking down a hall, you don't want to have them go on a worldwide adventure, around the world in 80 days to end up back in the hall to walk down the hall. Obviously, you need to use your judgment here about what your current pacing is and how much you want to add here and there, and how much is effective to be added here and there. But generally speaking, if your characters are getting from setting A to setting B, you can often put one or more things in between to give them more opportunities for development, give your more opportunities for interaction, more places to describe, more settings, more interesting stuff for the reader to enjoy. So that's kind of part number 2. So we have going through it slowly to like say, oh, I'll put character details here, I'll put setting details here, I'll put theme details here. That's number 1. Number 2 is these S curves, right? You have A to B, we put C and D in between A and B, but we still get from A to B, just it takes longer, right? These are things that you do early on in the editing process. And so, like that might be your 3rd and 4th drafts, say, right? So your second, your first draft is just blah, there it is. Your second draft kind of fixes a few problems here and there, and you're just kind of reading over it and making sure that nothing dumb is left in there, right? Then number 3 and number 4 could be, adding character details and putting in a couple of S curves. And of course, you can kind of mix these a little bit, but remember, the point that I made in my earlier video is that you want to focus your editing process so you don't like spend a bunch of time looking for typos when what you're trying to do is fix plot problems, right? Or, you don't spend a bunch of time looking for typos when what you really want to be doing is giving your character a more developed arc, right? You want to focus on these things so that you're not constantly like thinking about, oh, I'll do X, oh, I'll do Z, oh, I'll do B, oh, I'll do G. No, you want to do B through a thing with maybe a little bit of, C and D scattered in a little bit, but generally speaking, if you focus your efforts for a given redraft, you will have better results by focusing than by, going scattershot every single time and not really concentrating on any detail during your editing process. Okay, so the third type of edit focus that I want to talk about is what I'm calling a consistency check. And this is something that you would do later in the book or this is something you could do later in the editing process. You've kind of got your plot where you want it to be. You've got enough curves and twists and turns. Your characters are well developed. If you have a thematic element, it's discussed in various places. It's relatively subtle, so that so people don't feel like you're preaching at them, kind of thing. All these details. Now, what you want to do, and this is kind of the middle part of your editing process, is you want to think about consistency of things and make sure that you're not having, your character be described as having, in the worst case, you have a character who's described as having brown hair in chapter 1 and blonde hair in chapter 7, right? This is the kind of thing you want to avoid. And the reason that you want to kind of avoid these inconsistencies isn't because necessarily that, like, they're the most important thing or anything like that, but because what they can be for some readers is a major source of disbelief. And you want your readers to be able to suspend disbelief throughout the book. And so, the average person might read your book once, or, if it's a really good book, they might read it a couple of times, maybe even a few times. But what you want to do is you want to definitely, like, have that experience of going through the book, like, twice in relatively short succession, right? So what you're going to do for this type of editing, this type of redrafting focus, is you're going to read through the book at normal pace, and you're just going to kind of keep in the back of your mind details that appear throughout the book. Oh, this character, has a good sense of humor. This character wears sunglasses. This character does this. This character does that. This setting is like this. This setting is like that. This thematic element is treated this way, right? You're going to read through the book at roughly the normal pace. Or it might even just be a story, right? But you'll read through at the normal pace, and you'll just kind of try to get these details kind of floating around in your head. And then what you'll do is you'll read through it again. I'm kind of exaggerating here. If you're careful, and if you kind of slow down a little bit, and if you're really good at, like, maybe even taking some notes about details that are mentioned, you can do this in one read through. But if you're going to do multiple redrafts, you can focus on this for 2 or even 3 redrafts, and you can find a lot of inconsistencies. Like, oh, I did this. This doesn't make sense. Let's fix that. Basically, you read through, you kind of try to keep these details in your mind. They can be details about where the characters are, what the characters look like, what the characters know is a big one, right? Because if you have a character who is, living in a cave for 50 years or 20 years or something like that, and they come out and they're an internet wizard, right? You'll be like, well, how about, hold on a minute, right? Kind of thing. You were away from this for 20 years, and it was very different when you were 20 years younger than it is now. You shouldn't be, maybe you have a good learning curve, right? Maybe you were a web developer in 1995, right? And so you have kind of a head start, but you're still going to have that process of learning all those things to get into the modern version of whatever it is you're doing, right? And so, yeah, you'll think about, where characters are, how long it takes them to get from A to B, what they know, and when they learn it, right? So, Bob learned that Amy likes action movies in chapter 6, stuff like that. Other things you want to talk about is, like, what characters believe or what opinions they have. Does Jim like adventure movies? Does Jim like rock and roll? Does Jim like, classical music, right? Does Jim believe in, whatever, right? Whatever, personal peccadillo some character might have. Oh, they think the moon landing was faked, kind of thing, right? Another aspect is what tools or, means the characters have. Does the character have a car? If they have a car, then they can get from point A to point B relatively quickly if you need them to. But they can't get there at 400 miles an hour. Do they have, if they need to get from A to B at 400 miles an hour, then either, you need to space out the timing between A and B so they can make it with the tools that they have, or you need to figure out how to give them an airplane, right? And so, what you're going to do is you're basically going to read the story, and you're going to kind of try to get these ideas in your head, maybe even write some of them down if you're bad at remembering them, and then you're going to read through it again relatively soon, right? It doesn't have to be like same day, right? But like you read through, you make a few changes here and there, but what you're doing is you're kind of remembering these details, and then you start your next draft after that, And now on this time that you're going through again, you're like, oh, wait. He's allergic to ketchup in chapter 2, and I have him eating ketchup in chapter 8. That's not good. That's not good. I got to fix that. And generally speaking, you can always fix one of these inconsistencies in multiple ways. And so this is where the real time investment is going to happen, is that you're going to say, okay, well, I have him allergic to ketchup in chapter 2, and I have him eating ketchup in chapter 8. What are a few ways that I can fix this? Well, I can just cut the part about him being allergic to ketchup in chapter 2. I can cut the part about him eating ketchup in chapter 8. Or I could create some kind of a plot S, kind of an S curve that, his allergy to ketchup is cured in chapter 7 or chapter 4 or chapter 5, right? Or you could have him he was saying he was allergic to it in chapter 2 to avoid it because he wanted to avoid something else. Maybe they were putting the ketchup onto like seafood, and he doesn't like seafood, and so he was like, oh, I can't have that, it has ketchup on it. And then later on he's like, oh no, I just don't like seafood, but I prefer to say it. But it's easier to say I didn't want to eat ketchup, right? So you could and this is a part where you can sit down and kind of lean back and really think about creative things to do to make it so that any of these consistencies that you've created, whether intentionally or unintentionally, usually it's unintentionally, but sometimes you want an inconsistency, and what you want is the inconsistency to like stand out for a specific reason or something like that. He faked being allergic to ketchup, right? But generally speaking, if there are these inconsistencies, you need to make sure that they're handled in a way that the reader will be like, oh, I get it, kind of thing, right? As opposed to like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? The last thing you want a reader to be doing, well, there are some cases where you want your reader to do this, but generally speaking, if you're writing a fiction piece, the last thing you want your reader to be doing is stopping reading and being like, wait, why the hell is this happening? That doesn't make any sense. And like thinking about it and then flipping back and be like, what? An example from something that I've read recently was I read Brandon Sanderson's book, Mistborn, I think is what it's called. It was the first book in that series. And there's this point where he's very careful to say that the main character is fighting 8 people, right? And so it's supposed to be this really cool action scene where this main character is so skilled and so, adaptable that he manages to take out eight enemies using clever tactics and that kind of stuff. And, he's very careful to say 8 people, and then he's very careful to be like, this guy went down, and this guy went down, and this guy went down. And, like, as I was reading, I'm like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the scene ended, and I was like, well, wait, hold on a minute. And so I went back and read it again, and I read it again, and I read it again. It took me like 4 tries to finally find that 8th person getting knocked out because it was, tucked away in another sentence kind of thing. And you had to kind of sort of infer it. But once you saw like, oh, there it is, like there's the 8th person. That's what you don't want your reader to do. You don't want your reader to stop and get lost in figuring out why the hell this one thing happened. Generally speaking, you want your reader, to, especially if they're reading it for like a second or third time, to be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense at least, right? Unless you want it to not make sense deliberately, in which case you have a different set of requirements, but this technique still works, right? You need to make sure that the inconsistency is somehow, explained in the sense that like it would make sense to the reader that someone was lying somewhere, or someone misunderstood something, or there was a bad transmission, or something changed that we weren't told about, kind of thing. So that's kind of number 3, right? Is after you've added all the plot details, the setting details, the theme details, then you start looking at, well, wait a minute, did I write something that makes sense, or does this book start with a place getting hit with like a nuclear bomb, and then 6 months later everything there is fine and there's no lasting effects, kind of thing. You want to avoid those kind of inconsistencies, or if you want there to be inconsistency, then you have to craft it in such a way that it seems that the reader's like, oh, I kind of get what the author is going at there, right? So that's number 3. Number 4. And number 4 and number 5 are kind of things that you do at the end of the editing cycle. They're places that you focus at the end of the editing cycle. And again, you may mix these a little bit, but generally speaking, the more focused you are on 1 or 2 tasks for a redraft, the better you will be at finding those issues for that particular redraft. Because sometimes it requires different methods of reading. For instance, right? If you're looking for typos, grammatical errors, syntax errors, diction errors, you're going to want to read slowly. You're going to look at every word, and then once you're done reading every word in the sentence, you're going to want to look at the sentence and say, is this a run-on sentence? Did I use commas in the right place? Is this in a positive that I need to put in between commas? Should this part be parenthetical? Is this word hyphenated, or am I hallucinating that? That kind of thing. And so you'll want to read very slowly for that kind of editing. Whereas, as I just mentioned, with your consistency check, you'll want to read kind of at a regular pace, a little slower, but not that slow. You're going to want to read fast enough that you can kind of keep these details floating around in your memory, so that next time you read through, they're still in your kind of short to medium-term memory, and you can say, wait, that doesn't make sense. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Wait, that doesn't make sense, but I want it to not make sense, but it's not clear enough why it doesn't make sense. Okay, so final stage editing. 2 different methods here. And the first one is just, I'm going to call it trimming. And this is where it's very easy when editing and adding stuff to write things in there that you've kind of mentioned before. Because what'll happen is and this has happened to me a million times in editing, you'll be reading the chapter and you're like, oh, this would be a clever thing for this character to kind of say, or some character to say, and so you type that in. And then you notice that 2 sentences later or a paragraph later, someone makes that exact joke that you just made. It's like, oh, back it up, right? There's going to be places where you repeat yourself, where you put in unnecessary descriptions, things that kind of affect the pacing in a negative way. There are going to be places maybe where you just kind of like wrote too we're just too wordy for a part. Things just bloat in an area for no real reason other than that's kind of the mood you were in that day when you were writing that. And so what you'll find sometimes is that there will be a word or sentence or a phrase that is repeated or doesn't belong, or there's 4 paragraphs of description, and like the 4th paragraph kind of reiterates something that's in the first paragraph, something that's in the second paragraph, and it doesn't really say that much more than that other than just kind of put the same things in different words. Well, you might decide, and I'm not saying that you necessarily have to, but you might decide that 4th paragraph of description is just unnecessary and just cut it. There might be character interactions that just kind of don't go anywhere, right? Or not even necessarily, maybe interactions, but maybe also just like a character thinking to himself, right? Oh, I was thinking about, how much difficulty I was going to have on this job because I was thinking about all the paperwork that I was going to have to do. And there are places where that can fit, but you can also kind of overdo it sometimes. I just noticed this. I was re-editing the first chapter of my book, and there was like a whole paragraph where it's like, most of the stuff has already been said, and the rest of it kind of seems like it's setting something up, but I know that never goes anywhere. So I just cut that whole paragraph out. And I didn't just remove it entirely. What I did was I copied it into a separate document so that I could be like, oh, well, if I ever want to plug this back in or rework it, I can always look at that document. But, reading it again after that, I was like, no, that paragraph didn't add anything to the book. So it's gone. There were places where I put something in. There are places where I used a word multiple times in short spans. He thought something, he considered something, he imagined something, right? As opposed to he thinks. He considered, he theorized, he hypothesized, he thinks, he mulled over, right? There's all kind of, there are cases where you're going to get into like a rhythm where you use the same word over and over again, and there are cases where you want to do that. Like there's actually one really good case where I used the word observe twice in like 2 paragraphs, and what it's doing, and I didn't realize it was doing this when I wrote it, but what it's doing is a character saying, I need to observe this. and then just a couple of paragraphs later, I write, he observed this, right? And there's a connection there because basically he's trying to figure out if there's like if like the people that are holding him hostage have a weakness, right? And so he's like, okay, I need to be cautious. I need to not provide them any extra information, and I need to be observant for any weaknesses that I see in either the way that they carry themselves, or in any of the equipment that they use, or in any of the stuff that's actually holding us here. And so, 2 paragraphs later, the pirate comes in and is talking to him, and the character who we're kind of in the POV for this particular chapter is like, I observed this. And so, there are cases where you want to do repetition, right? But generally speaking, if you're just writing, a bunch of stuff and you use the word think 4 times in 2 paragraphs, you might want to switch it up a little bit. And so this is another thing that you can do during this kind of late term trim point. You tighten your language, you improve your pacing, you get rid of any repetition that doesn't belong there. You read slowly, but you're not focusing on each word necessarily, but kind of more, you're focusing on like the combinations of actions and descriptions. And if you see the same action or description kind of happening over and over again, then you either remove it or you change it so that it's a little bit different, assuming it's not supposed to be that way. You look for the same words popping up. You ask if it helps. And again, this is something that you do for late stage edits. Now, finally, and this isn't necessarily going to be the last thing that you do, but it probably should be, is the most obvious thing, right? If you're going to put something out there, if you're going to try to publish something or publish or self-publish or submit a manuscript for publication to someone else, right? The most obvious thing, and this is the first one I thought of, so it's a little funny that we're talking about it last, but the most obvious is just a straight up line edit. You go through and you read really stupidly slowly, because what you're doing is you're looking at each word in a sentence, and then once you finish looking at each word in the sentence, you look at the sentence itself. You're checking for grammar, you're checking for syntax, you're checking for diction, you're checking for typographical errors. In this kind of editing, you actually don't want to think too much about the plot or the character. You just want to be looking at the words, because otherwise it's going to take extra long, because you're going to look through this sentence, and you're going to look at the sentence, and then you're going to be like, well, is this consistent with this character? I mean, you can do a little bit of that, but you're going to end up slowing yourself down a lot more if you're reading slow enough to focus on like the actual word choice, the actual syntax, the actual grammar, the actual spelling, and then you're also layering on top of that more high-level thoughts. Because, I mean, I've seen someone say, this was in a TV show or a movie or something, where like, oh, don't read it, just edit it, right? But in order to do proper line editing, you actually have to look at every single word. You can't just be like, meh, and kind of, unless you have like some kind of supernatural ability to catch typos. It's not just typos, right? Because there are cases where you could have a run-on sentence, or you could have a semicolon in the wrong place, or you could be using commas where you should be using semicolons, or vice versa, or you could have a colon that isn't properly placed. This is the most obvious thing, and this is the thing that people think of when they think of editing to a certain degree. They're like, I'm just going to figure out all the typos. But you can't just look for words where it's like, oh, I wrote, I spelled cookie wrong, right? Because there are places where like, oh, I hit the brakes. But like your spell check isn't going to determine if you wrote hit the brakes BREAKS, your spell checker is not going to fix that probably. But a careful look at every single word will be like, oh, that's not the right brakes, right? I want BRAKES, like as in the brakes on a car. And so you're going to actually kind of go slow for this kind of editing if this is your focus. That is, if you want to do it right. You don't want to do this stage multiple times generally, which is why you put it last, because you've already done all your additions, you've already done all of your trimming, you've already kind of cut out all the stuff that you're not going to worry about. Your book is at the length that it's going to end up at. Now you just got to make sure that all the sentences fit together and don't that you're not doing IT''s where you just mean ITS or vice versa, and that you're there, and theirs are right, And so even though this is the most obvious focus for editing. This is the thing that's like, oh, obvious number one, right? Number one. Check for grammar, check for diction, check for syntax, check for typos. But that's actually going to be about the last thing that you do with the book, because everything else you're going to be taking stuff away and adding stuff in such a way that you can create more of these errors. So anyway, I went a little longer than I thought I would, but yeah, that is 5 different focuses or focuses, 5 different places to focus for individual stages of editing, right? Early on, you add development, you add character descriptions, you add setting descriptions, you add thematic elements, you add these plot S-curves where person gets from A to B and it's too simple. You put some curves in there, they still get from A to B, but something happens in between. Maybe multiple things happen in between that make it more interesting, make it so that this character is not just a Superman, walking imperviously from A to B. He actually comes into some kind of a problem on the way there. Mid-stage editing. Mid-stage editing, you do consistency checks, and you do trimming. You look for repetition, right? And then finally, late stage, more trimming, more looking for repetition, more looking for things to cut away to improve the pacing, tighten the language, check for typographical errors, grammar, syntax, diction, all that good stuff. And that stuff comes last. So there we go. Talked about each at length, summarized at the end. Hopefully this works out for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to try to read Second Stage Lensman this week and get a review up of that. Might be a little later in the week. So happy Monday, and I hope you have a good week. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Any comments or thoughts be appreciated. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And I will, other than that, just say, have a great week, and I'll see you soon.